All right, well, welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. I'm your host, Chris Britton. Today's guest is Andrew Langer, president of the Institute for Liberty and the director of the Center for Regulatory Freedom for the CPAC Foundation. Andrew has spent more than 25 years at the Center of the Free Market and Limited Government movement, testifying before Congress nearly 24 times, advising policymakers, and speaking to audiences nationwide. He's a globally recognized expert on how regulation impacts business and innovation, and he's regularly called on to analyze the real-world consequences, intended and unintended, for federal policy. Before leading IFL and CRF, Andrew served as the principal regulatory affairs lobbyist for the National Federation of Independent Business, the nation's largest small business association. He's also a seasoned voice in media with appearances in major television networks, years as a radio host, and a regular commentator in outlets like Town Hall, The Daily Caller, The American Spectator, and National Review. Andrew holds a master's in public administration from Troy University and studied international relations at William & Mary. Andrew, welcome back to GovExperts Insights.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Now, you've written and advised on everything from airline competition to regulatory modernization to market-based reforms across the transportation sector. Today, we're talking specifically about your recent letter to the editor in the Wall Street Journal, responded to the journal's editorial board on the FAA and air traffic control reform. Now, let's start with the timing. This episode comes right on the eve of America's biggest travel week,
Right.
Thanksgiving. I have a daughter that I'm hoping to get home from college on Friday, I think tomorrow. So we're going to test the system out, at least from a family perspective there. Now, the government has finally reopened. Flight schedules should be back at full capacity, but we came very close to a catastrophic breakdown in the air travel system. And even now, as air traffic controllers are back to getting paid again, we still see examples of staff shortages. So I want to just say, talk a little bit about, where we stand in terms of the air traffic system, talk about some of the privatization, suggestions that have been made out there, the pros and the cons of those, and a little bit of background. The shutdown has ended. What's your sense of where we are right now?
Listen, I dealt with this myself. It's actually kind of funny. I had to do, as we're recording this, a week before, I had 2 trips back to back. I was heading out to Indianapolis on some healthcare policy work, and I was worried about that because there was a quick turnaround between that and when I was heading up to New York for some family stuff. A couple of days later, was going to fly up to New York from Richmond, Virginia. And it's funny because so the Sunday before these 2 trips, my wife and I made the decision that we just couldn't chance the fact that our Thursday flight that week might be canceled. So we decided to drive. And then literally the next day, as I was getting ready to go do this quick trip to Indianapolis, literally my flight's supposed to leave at 10:30 the night before, everything's all set. And 7 a.m. the day of, I find out that my flight's been canceled, and then I'm booked on another flight. And I was very worried about coming home. Hedged my bets, knowing my karmic energy in the universe. So I packed an extra set of clothes, thus guaranteeing that I would not be delayed. Because if I had not packed those clothes, I would have been stranded somewhere. But the point is, I've dealt with this last week. I've dealt with the issue of air traffic control shortages in the past. This is part of the reason why I will not, if I can help it, fly in and out of Newark, because that's a perennial problem. That being said, I think this is one of those instances in which privatization is not the answer. I know it's a lot of folks think it's the answer to everything. I'm not sure it's the answer in this case. I think there are lots of reasons for that, which we can get into.
Well, you've given a great example of how the shutdown kind of affected, the country in very practical terms. The folks that have tuned in, what's the human side of air traffic control staffing? What happens inside the towers and the approach centers during a prolonged shutdown?
Well, it's not even during a prolonged shutdown. I mean, I think what happens in a shutdown is what happens in any agency when you have folks who are required to go to work. I've had family members who were required to go to work during the shutdown, and they were not happy. It does not engender a great deal of feeling. I think it doesn't engender it in folks who might not have been paid otherwise, which is concerning. But let's be really clear: this is a resource that it's not sexy, and so it tends to get short shrift when it comes to funding. Let me sort of give you a little bit of background, sort of on the how I started getting involved in this issue or concerned about this issue. Years ago, there was an instance at Reagan National Airport in DC, in which an air traffic controller working a late night shift fell asleep in the tower. And I got a call from a major news network wanting me to come on and use it as an opportunity to beat up on the Air Traffic Controllers Union and unionization. And I said, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, because we all know how narratives get manipulated. But there's a national security issue here that is far more important. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, if a flight coming into DC can't raise the tower, why didn't somebody from the Capitol Police Force, why didn't they go up into the tower and investigate why the tower had gone dark? Why is it X, Y, and Z? A simple phone call could have sort of determined what was going on up there. And they were stunned because no one had quite raised that issue in that way before. But to me, at the end of the day, there are certain things that we maintain as part of the core work of our federal government, and among them is this kind of health, safety, national security perspective, and air traffic controllers are a vital part of this. Now, I know that they're not military in the same way that, say, air traffic, not even air traffic controllers, but radar and radar monitors are within the U.S. military, keeping watch on our friendly skies coming in. But nevertheless, to me, I've always looked at this as more of a national security issue than I have as far as a privatization or government service issue.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective to view it from, and certainly very important. As we think about that, what's the role of the airlines in regards to the air traffic control, of support of the air traffic control system?
Well, I mean, I think certainly we could go to like some kind of a user fees model to go and do this. Obviously, they are the ones who are utilizing the service and utilizing it as a function of their ability to deliver passengers. In the same way, listen, that anybody who uses sort of public resources in terms of transport, has an obligation to pay their fair share in all of this. Of course, as we all know, that eventually gets transferred down to consumers. But the one thing we don't want to do is, and one of the problems that we have invariably, obviously there's great merit to a contracting system in terms of being able to save money for the taxpayers. But what you don't want to do is compromise safety and national security to someone who is bidding, who is offering up the lowest price for delivering whatever that service is. It's the old gallows humor line that the astronauts used to use during the Apollo missions, right? I'm sitting on top of the world's most complex machinery built at the lowest cost from the lowest cost bidder.
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong? We obviously, not that I want to equate it with that. There are obviously opportunities there. Yeah, this is so that's sort of how I look at this. I mean, obviously, it's the airlines as a service provider, and obviously there are ways to modernize it and make it better. But the privatization part may not be the best way to go about doing it. And by the way, let's say that this is something. These are issues that are not just touching the airlines, but are really touching all aspects of a transportation and massive transportation systems. So it's something that's hitting the train industry, both on freight and passenger side, and then also trucking as well. Sort of this balance, how these things balance out.
Well, and as you were talking about the air traffic control system and the public safety and the national security interests, of course, I know that there have been also calls to privatize the TSA, and would the same logic hold true there in regards to the national security aspect of it, obviously the public safety aspect of it. I think your point, tell me if I'm missing this in any way, is that you've got to view these things in these broader national interests to be able to view it, and then figure out whatever financing system needs to be done in order to support it, and try to solve for some of the incentives that you want relative to technology and upgrades and modernization along the way.
100%. And let me sort of dovetail it into another area, which it has nothing to do with TSA and has nothing to do with air traffic control. But for instance, one of the things that I focus on in my work on healthcare policy is looking at healthcare as a resource economics issue, which is to say, the widget is the amount of time that someone spends with their medical care provider. And we can talk about equipment use and pharmaceuticals and all that, but at its barest bones, the issue we have right now is that we don't have enough doctors to meet the number of patients that we have. And there's a gap that continues to widen. And it's not just as simple as creating new medical school billets or medical schools for that matter, but we have not changed the formula for how we fund residency programs. And residency programs are funded through federal dollars, Medicare and Medicaid. Now, I would be happy. I would love it if we can find an alternative mechanism for funding medical school residencies that doesn't require us to put more money into Medicare or Medicaid. But so far, I haven't found that. No one has demonstrated to me that there's a different way to do it, which means to me that we need to go down this road. Sometimes it's just the nature of the beast given where we are. But with regards to this, yeah, I think that at the end of the day, what we don't want is to compromise on our safety and security. God forbid something goes wrong with a contractor. Now, obviously, they would be held accountable for it. But in this instance, right, we let's not engage in some kind of privatization experimentation. Let's just focus on where the problems are here and work there. I mean, nobody has yet demonstrated that the fundamental problem with the air traffic control system in America is that the air traffic controllers are government employees. What we do understand is that they are taxed in terms of their timing. We're not putting enough of them in the towers. In fact, we're trying to pull more of them out of the towers, and we are not giving them a modernized equipment to use to get the job done. And let's focus on that as opposed to sort of pulling this into a greater debate about what should be privatized and what should not be.
Let's delve a little bit into the shutdown specifically, and things before we get to kind of some of the systemic issues. But what do you see as the biggest risk that if the shutdown had continued? Delays, cancellations, more safety issues?
Well, yeah, it gets down to, all right, a lot of folks don't get that it's not just about who's in the tower, but it's about all of the other services and opportunities that are made available to folks who are government workers. If you are, let's say that you are an essential worker working at an intelligence agency and you are called into work during the shutdown because you, as I said, you are essential. Yes, you go into work and yes, you're going to do your job. But what folks forget is the maintenance staff, some of the IT folks who may not be deemed essential, the folks who work in the Starbucks in your federal building aren't coming to work. And if you're essentially in a secure facility all day, you can't go off campus to get lunch or get your coffee or what have you. So you're going to work, you're doing this hard and very vital work. You're not getting paid. You're worried about when you're going to get paid. That creates its own phrase I like to use is it creates its own gravy. It creates its own anxiety that's in there. So that contributes to, just like with any circumstance in which someone is anxious about the future of their employment, how they're going to make ends meet, it compromises their ability to do a job effectively, right? If you're worried, if you're an air traffic controller and your attention has to be on your job for however long your shift is, and you're not being paid, and you're up at night because or during the day, whenever you're getting your downtime, you are not able to relax effectively because you are so worried about making ends meet. That has the effect of compromising your ability to do the job that you're being paid to do. And I don't think it doesn't mean you're a bad person. I mean, it means you're
Sure.
absolutely human.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Now, is the FAA uniquely exposed to shutdowns, or more uniquely, is it somewhat uniquely exposed to the shutdowns compared to other agencies?
Well, I think, just because so much of it is unsung, that's not to say that the other agencies aren't unique in their own way, right? I think everyone, when you don't pay military personnel, when you don't pay anybody in the national security apparatus, to during, a time when they are deemed essential and deemed working, I think it compromises any of those circumstances. I think it's a little bit more unique only because folks don't quite understand the vital nature of the air traffic control system, just in terms of making, right. At the very least, with rail transportation, at least they're on rails, right? And yes, there are things that can go wrong, and I want to say it was during the shutdown that we had a major rail accident in Virginia. Didn't get a lot of press attention, largely because, there were no injuries. But, 53 rail cars went off the rails, spilling their contents into a swamp and shutting down essentially the major rail line on the Tidewater of Virginia. But the point is, if that would have been tragic, if it had been some kind of an air disaster that was out there.
So the
Which,
point is, air
by
traffic
the way,
control.
we already had one, just a few months back in DC. That was not air traffic control's fault, but was the fault of sort of pilot error.
So the air traffic control system is more fragile than the public realizes, both in a shutdown and then also, I think that you just pointed out, in relatively normal times.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, it is already a situation where they are using outmoded technology. Something, I say outmoded technology. Maybe I shouldn't say that, because at the end of the day, there's stuff that works. So if they're using sort of mechanical, I don't even know what they call them, mechanical blocks to stack the planes and have them figure out where they, how they line up in order, that works. On the other hand, it would be great if we had some kind of, prioritization tool that can help these guys figure it out. Maybe it's not so much a matter of hiring more workers or privatization, but finding ways to utilize AI as a way of prioritization in terms of flights, how you get them, quote unquote, stacked. If you're listening, I used air quotes there. That's what it's called, sort of creating the order of how flights are landing and taking off. It is a complex dance, sort of looking at any individual airfield, let alone the general airspace. There's a lot of, the movie that came out a few years ago, Pushing Tin. There's a lot of tin being pushed in the air out there.
So, I mean, it's safe to say too that the complexity and the volume are only increasing, and probably at a rate.
Listen, add to this the issue of privatized, a drone,
Mhm.
flying car flight, individual transportation options. Tim Jackson, who was my colleague at NFIB, has really cornered the market. He wrote a book called Dude, Where's My Flying Car? And the organization of how that civilian traffic gets prioritized, that's going to be huge. I mean, at the anyway, so that's that the someone is going to have to be the arbiter of which traffic is going to go where. And in the same way, right, that we look at how the public airwaves are divvied up, and that's done by the FCC. Again, we have to recognize, this commons issue, and it becomes more complicated when it's a private entity out there doing it.
Yeah. So as we talk about the privatization question and then kind of where we are, flight delays, flight reductions, big travel woes, you know, political pressure as a result of these situations always kind of reopen the long running debate about, privatization role as you've kind of alluded to. Other countries like Canada have privatized air control. What, I guess, kind of a couple things. What are the stated benefits of that model, and how did they do relative to what they tried to get to?
Well, I mean, obviously there are fits and starts. I think, Canada has the benefit of not having the same amount of air travel going across as we do, or the population that we do. And I think that and given that their population is comprised around a few key centers, it makes it easier for them to go down that road. Things are so decentralized in the United States that I think it becomes much, much harder for us to do. And they've had their problems. Frankly, I'm not an expert on Canada, but at the end of the day, I can point to areas in the United States where privatization has, some of it works and some of it doesn't work. And here, I don't think we would want that.
Well, why did the proponents of privatization argue that it would improve reliability, technology adoption, and staffing? I mean, you've that presumes there's funding available for that, and the incentives are to invest in those things. But what is your perspective on those arguments?
Well, right. I mean, listen, I get it. I mean, this is the sort of the standard argument for privatization. My good friend and colleague John Palatiello talks about this. There are basically, if you can look something up in the phone book and find a service for it in the phone book, the federal government should or government shouldn't be doing it. And I think that's right in things like custodial issues or provision of coffee services and things like that. I think it gets a little bit more complicated and the benefits a little bit more nebulous when you're talking about things that have to do with national security or public health and safety. Basically, if your goal, you can have the goal of saving money. I mean, that's a laudable goal. Obviously, we don't want the federal government to overspend, but you don't want to compromise on that when you're talking about these national security issues. If we want modernization, yeah, I mean, businesses are constantly engaged or should be constantly engaged in capital expenditures. I think it gets a little bit different when you're talking about government contractors, right? Because they're always focused on making sure that their contract is going to get renewed, and they're bidding against other people. So, they're not necessarily interested in capital investment as so much as they are in sort of the perpetuation of providing the service. The other problem is when there are problems that get identified, it's just as bureaucratic to get rid of a bad contractor as it is to get rid of a bad employee. And we don't ever really seem to talk about this. I talk to folks in the intelligence world who are dealing with civilian contractors providing them with data or providing them with data analytical services, and there's an enormous amount of frustration that can be held when a contractor is not living up to the aspects of their contracts, and worse, because of the bureaucracy, is getting those contracts renewed. No, I mean, at the end of the day, listen, someone has to, in government, make the decision: we're going to modernize. We're going to spend the money. We're going to spend the money on these capital expenditures. We're going to spend the money on staff, and we're gonna make this next step. But it takes somebody having the initiative to do that. And I would feel in this instance much more comfortable with that.
So it brings us some very interesting
Now, hold
points
on,
in
Chris.
regard.
Let me just add to this. I mean, to be clear, I also want to make it clear this is not an automatic defense of, let's say, NATCA, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. What we need to make sure is that NATCA is not standing in the way of making sure that we modernize. Again, we can go back and forth as to whether or not there should be one person in a tower, two people in the tower. That is something that can go through there could you know, you can make those cases on all kinds of sides, but at the end of the day, what we want to make sure is that whoever's in the tower, if it's one person or two people, has the best equipment available to them, that equipment is reliable, and that they're being treated in a way that that incentivizes their being there and their continued service.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because as you spoke earlier, I kept thinking back to Reagan and the 80s and the Air Traffic Control Union. And the action that Reagan took there was one out of a national security and a public safety interest that gave him the motivation and the impetus to take that step. And so it's we still continue to debate that issue as we're chatting
So
today. One of the things is as you talked, I wanted to ask you for the core functions of government, national security, public safety. I think is your point that we need to be careful about how we approach those systems, the role of privatization and private contractors, because ultimately, if the public wants to be able to hold their elected office holders accountable for those core functions being, stewarded, being adhered to, is that kind of I mean, I'm not trying to pin you down
it's
because there's
part
going to
of
be
it.
exceptions to everything, but is that kind of the bigger picture view here that you're bringing?
I think it is. I think the other part of this is that there's a certain degree of transparency and accountability that can happen with regards to, maintaining this as a function of government within the national security, homeland security apparatus, as opposed to, what's happening in the private sector. And obviously, as you point out, there are exceptions everywhere. There are always going to be these kinds of failures, but in this kind of an instance, I feel more comfortable and confident having that to be part of the government apparatus where there are these checks and balances that are out there, than opposed to adding what is essentially another layer of bureaucracy in terms of contract review, and trying to find somebody accountable in that regard.
Well, then you're going to have to find people that manage that contract, and that's a challenge in and of itself.
Exactly.
But this is where one of the things where I think your argument really kind of stands out, and the fact that you're making it, because you're a deregulation advocate. I mean,
100%.
people expect you to support privatization, but you argue that privatization for the air traffic control system in America is not necessarily the best solution. And so I wanted to talk what, your Wall Street Journal letter, you know, kind of walk us through what motivated you to write that, and the main points that you were trying to raise in response to
Well, at the
the
end of
to
the
the
day, I
annual
think it's
report.
because there is this sort of natural impulse on the part of conservatives and libertarians, conservatarians, to say privatization, privatization, privatization. And especially when we're dealing with government employee unions and all of those things. So, one of the guiding principles that I've, long maintained in my work is the issue of comparative risk assessment. And actually, before I get to comparative risk assessment, let me quote from one of my mentors over the years, a gentleman named Fred Smith, not the FedEx Fred Smith, but Fred Smith from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, who used to caution against the idea of trying to run government like a business. He says, we want government to be efficient when it needs to be efficient, but you don't want, for instance, no one can say that the Nazis weren't efficient at getting the trains to the concentration camps. So, efficiency for efficiency's sake isn't all that it's cracked up to be. At some point in time, you have to recognize that there are checks and balances and the competing interests that are at work here. Um, with regards to the comparative risk assessment issue is we're always needing to look at the unintended consequences of what we do. A good example, the EPA during the Biden administration wanted to effectively ban something called methylene chloride. Methylene chloride. Nobody knows what it is, but as it happens, it's a gas that's used to disinfect medical gear and medical devices in areas where you can't use heat and alcohol or alcohol. And as it happens, yeah, there can be some cancer risk related to exposure. And that's why they wanted to essentially take the exposure level so low as to de facto ban it. But the problem is you can't get a medical procedure in the United States without at least one major piece of equipment in the medical theater being sterilized with methylene chloride. And so, you have to look at the unintended consequences. What happens? We understand that asbestos, if you breathe it in, is bad. And if you, breathe it in every day at work, it's bad. You're going to get some form of a lung cancer or some other kind of cancer. But what are the unintended consequences of effectively banning asbestos in all kinds of construction? What happens when you decide you are going to open up a policy which demands that all asbestos be ripped out of buildings if it's found in place and hasn't caused any harm? So my point is, I'm always proceeding with caution. Anytime we're trying to shake up the system. One of my favorite Supreme Court cases is a 1992 Supreme Court case called New York versus United States. And in it, Justice O'Connor says, and yeah, I can quote this verbatim, the Constitution protects us from our own best intentions. It divides power among sovereigns and among branches of government precisely so that we might resist the temptation to concentrate power in one location as the expedient solution to the crisis of the day. Now, in that, Justice O'Connor is talking about federalism and federalism, securing liberty because it diffuses sovereign power. But you take that out, you pull that back out, and you parse out the individual portions of it, and there are a number of truisms there, which is that we have a system of government that is supposed to be deliberative because we don't want to make policy in a crisis, because policy in a crisis is inevitably bad policy or invariably bad policy, and it's really hard to undo. So I'm guided by that in all of my regulatory work to just think a little bit more empirically about it. Is this really where we want to go with this? What's the goal? And does this get us to the goal? And what might be the unintended consequences? I'm sorry,
Is your
pontificating, but we know that ultra processed foods can cause all kinds of health problems. But what happens if we make the definition of ultra processed foods so overly broad that we wind up getting rid of foods that are low sugar or low carb that could otherwise help with dealing with America's epidemic of diabetes and obesity? So these are the kinds of things, and I know it surprises people when I go down this way, but it's like, no, let's think a little bit more about this stuff.
So is your thinking that this discussion is a little bit fueled by populist tendencies?
Right. I think very much so. And I also think that, there's the old aphorism that, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're a privatization hammer, everything is going to look like a nail that you need to deal with in terms of privatization. I get it. I have no book with my colleagues who are very vociferous advocates, or if you're an anti-union advocate, wanting to go down that road, or an anti-government union advocate. I just think we need to listen. I have qualms about government employees unionizing because I think that that just creates huge, huge problems. But I don't think the answer is to, get rid of, or privatize the air traffic controllers.
But if you go back to the yellow page test that you mentioned earlier, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that there's an air traffic control function listed in the yellow pages, if there
No,
are
I
even
mean, I
yellow
think
pages anymore.
I mean, I don't know about, about how far it goes in terms of drilling down to private airfields and what needs to do there. But you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, it's usually the responsibility of the airport's authority, if they're not sort of at that level there, to go and do it. I know that in terms of aircraft repair and maintenance, that's obviously all privatized because I know the guys who work in that trade association.
So on the privatization initiative, you mentioned the unintended consequences and some intended, but how would this effort affect smaller airports, rural communities, and general aviation?
Well, right, and that's a fundamental question, which is if it becomes non-competitive for these folks, if you're a local contractor and you can't provide the people for some kind of smaller airfield. Listen, here's at the end of the day, right? There's already enough pressure on smaller airports, and obviously some of them have carve outs. I just watched a video the other day of the oh god, where were they flying to? That there is a mandate that the airlines serve Beckley, West Virginia. Now, I've been to Beckley. It's the gateway to the New River Valley, but there's a mandatory subsidized flight between Beckley and Charleston, West Virginia. At the same time, I know that the airport closest to where I live, which is Newport News, Williamsburg, or used to be called Patrick Henry Airport, I don't even know if there's a major airline flying in and out of there. There are so many pressures that are on the airlines themselves. I'd hate to see an airport get shut down because we can't find the air traffic control contractors to do the job.
Well, yeah, and the areas that are going to be impacted what would be considered the flyover area from the major metropolitan airports. So that feeder system would be severely challenged under that. And then not to mention too that I think there's going to be significant governance issues because depending on how you went about this, is it going to be on a local airport or a regional basis? Is it something that how do you when you're dealing with multiple governmental entities, things you've got to have a standard set of processes across that, and you also need to have kind of one entity in charge. In this case, it's the federal government.
Absolutely. And listen, at the end of the day, right? I mean, we've seen what happens with, contractors elsewhere in the national security area, and sometimes it works well, and sometimes it goes spectacularly horribly. And when you're dealing with lives in the air, I don't particularly want to take that gamble.
So, in your observation of what's gone on in other countries, be it Canada or the United Kingdom or others, mixed results. What are the problems that you've seen there? Things
All
and
right.
countries that experimented with.
At the end, I've always found it ironic that nations that socialize everything else have gone down the road of privatizing in this particular area. I just don't think that they've gotten the benefit out of it that they want to. It hasn't produced the end results there. Obviously, there haven't been any major disasters that have accrued from this, but I also think other nations, they deal with their issues of modernization perhaps differently than we do. Here's my point is at the end of the day, if you want to modernize and you want a modern air traffic control system, we can do that without compromising on security and safety.
And so, and let's explore kind of the alternatives, things to privatization. I think so. Obviously, we got the status quo, which we don't think is meeting our expectations. Things. What are the ways that we can look at improving that system short of privatization, or with some privatization that's not necessarily wholesale?
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, right, you can go and you can enter into partnerships with the airlines in terms of sort of maintaining a system and having it better funded and really having a race to the top in terms of, figuring out which technologies are going to be the ones that work. Here's the thing. The other part of this is, and I don't want to delay innovation or attempts at innovation, and I also don't want to think that AI is the answer to everything. But I would love to know what kind of an answer an Elon Musk has for dealing with this issue, in terms of sort of figuring this out. And obviously, they've gone, obviously he's got experience both working with the civil service, but also as a contractor. I'd love to see what kind of a solution somebody like that can come up with, or identifying the technologies that may be right down the road and around the corner. But the reality is, yeah, I mean, I think it starts with having a frank conversation about what it is that we want. What is the problem that we want to solve? Is it a staffing problem? Is it a staffing fatigue problem? Is it a perception among the staff of how they're being treated? Is it an incentivization problem that's out there? I think what we're going to find at the end of the day is that we have been woefully inadequate at updating the technology, because that's what we do as a society. We sort of wait and wait and wait and wait. And having some kind of a 5, 10 year outlook as to where we want to be with this and move towards those goals.
Do you see any legislation or appropriation strategies coming out of Congress that try to address some of these issues other than the privatization?
Not as of yet, but and I think this is once again where somebody like an Elon Musk can be helpful, now that he's back in the president's good graces. That leadership is going to have to come from the White House. It's going to have to come from Sean Duffy, who is very open, as he has talked about on numerous occasions, finding ways to modernize a whole host of areas. In fact, it's one of those things where the Department of Transportation just put out a request for information on recommendations in terms of freight transportation. So they are hungry for ideas, but at the same time, we have to guard it. I just saw the story. The Surface Transportation Board, the folks who are in charge of rail safety, are largely dragging their feet when it comes to deploying new technologies that can, in real time, determine track safety. And we need to make sure that those things are being deployed, or at least studied at the very least. I think if we started by launching some kind of a study, I'm happy to sort of look at it from both sides, both the issue of modernized government run system, and maybe doing some pilots on some kind of a privatized basis or hybridized privatized basis. I'd be happy to look at those things. But we have to have that frank conversation about it and then get leadership from folks in Washington.
It would be interesting to hear Elon Musk's opinion on it. Things, and you mentioned it earlier, but the role of artificial intelligence in it, the ability to analyze and process all of that data in regards to what's flying, and to be able to advise the human controller that is sitting there. Could that help with that job burnout? Could it help with the capacity issue? And that's what I say. The shutdown kind of exposed problems, but as you point out, it didn't cause them. I mean, Senator Cruz and others have been warning of an ongoing air traffic controller shortage. What's your understanding and perception on the shortage, and how serious is it?
Well, it's fundamentally serious. I mean, listen, this is exactly, if you've ever flown, if you've flown or tried to fly in and out of Newark Airport in the last couple of years. I mean, Newark was problematic before. It's gotten even worse now. I think they also were down a runway for a while. But the air traffic controllers who were servicing Newark, there were cuts that were made, and then they moved the operation down to southern Jersey. Newark is within the New York City airspace. Why they moved it down there, I don't know. So they've been shortchanged on their air traffic controllers for a while. And so invariably, if you're trying to go in and out of Newark, you're going to experience delays, you're going to experience flight cancellations, and it is a huge problem. And then with the fatigue of the air traffic controllers who remain, it really is a disaster just waiting to happen. This is one of those areas where it should never be a one size fits all approach in terms of how many personnel are in a tower at any given time. Here, there needs to be more eyes on the ball, as opposed to fewer.
What's your thinking on how fast the FAA is training new controllers? I mean, it's obviously not fast enough, but is there attention to that? Is there ways to improve it?
Well, I mean, listen, there's always ways to improve. I think it's slow going, but I think right now it is all about recruitment and retention, right? It has less to do with training as it does with making sure that you are able to hire people, you're offering them a competitive wage, and you're offering them a job environment that addresses the fundamental stress that is there. And I think we need to be doing a much better job in that work. But again, the answer is not privatization, because I'm not sure a corporation would do any better at these things. The answer is just the attention within the federal government itself.
So now this has been a fascinating conversation. I did want to ask, what's been the reaction to your letter to the editor in the journal?
You know, it's been mixed. I mean, obviously, I've gotten a couple of folks who've reached out to me saying thank you for saying this, really appreciate it. You know, folks who are airline or airline adjacent, and then I've got the privatization experts who were not so sanguine about it all. I got a nasty's too strong a word. I got a very strong note of disapproval, got tagged in a note of disapproval by somebody on LinkedIn. But this is always the case. When you write something, there are going to be folks who agree with you and folks who disagree with you.
And that's the beauty of our democracy and deliberative system. So I appreciate you putting it out there and
Thanks.
having the conversation in regards to it. Before we go, I wanted to ask if you had one piece of advice that you could tell lawmakers that they need to focus on in regards to the air traffic control system, what would it be?
Listen, I think I think it starts with a series of hearings. I think the Congress ought to be producing a white paper in conjunction with the Department of Transportation on this, or at least doing their own white paper and presenting it to DOT. But when Sean Duffy goes up to the Hill to ask for more funds for the air traffic controllers, maybe we ought to give it to him.
Here, here, Billings. And I do hope everyone has a safe travel this weekend and it is glitch free.
Yes. Listen, as a result of all of this, the AAA is saying that there are going to be 88 million people. I think it's 80, maybe it's 82. More than 80 million
It's a
people are going to
record,
be
though,
on the
right?
roads for Thanksgiving. Largest car travel day ever. So just be careful out there.
Andrew, thank you very much for taking time to visit with us. And to those folks that have tuned in, if you've enjoyed this discussion, we'd encourage you to subscribe to GovExperts Insights, wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to include Andrew's Wall Street Journal letter and related analysis in the show notes. Thank you to everyone who has tuned into this episode, and we hope you have a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.